Erev Tov lekulam. Good evening, everyone. A good Erev Shabbos. Welcome to the pre-Shabbos sermon of Parshas Lech Lecha. Parshas Lech Lecha is a parsha that's full of the story of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu means Avraham, our father. A man once stormed into the office of the Secretary of the Interior of New York State and demanded a passport. Give me a passport, he says. I'm leaving the country. I can't live here anymore. The clerk was surprised. He says, why? Why can't you live here anymore? He says, I can't live. He says, two reasons. First of all, I can't live under the rule of Donald Trump. He divides the country. He has no advice for the coronavirus. The clerk says, wait a minute. This week we're having elections. Maybe Joe Biden will win. He says, that's the other reason I'm leaving the country. Nations have great people. Nations have names for their great people. For example, the generation of people that builds a new society gets a special name. And every country has their own way to refer to them. Like, for example, in the land of Israel, it's called the founders' generation. Or the other people, the other great leaders of the land of Israel are called Gedolei Ha'umah, the great people of the nation. And there's a plot where all their Gedolei Ha'umah are buried. In the Greek philosophy, the leaders were called, the great ones are called philosophers, or in Rome, they're called emperors or gods in some cases. What are the greats of our people called? The greats of our people are called fathers and mothers, avot and imahot, or in European, oves and imohes. And we say it so many times in this week's parsha, and in many other places in Torah, for example, it says, I will bless you upon the land that I promised to your forefathers, avoisechem, your fathers. Or as I swore to your forefathers, avoisechem, your fathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We even open our daily prayers with that statement, a mention of our forefathers, God and God of our fathers. Whenever we mention Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, in Hebrew, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, we give them the title Avinu, our father. And anytime we mention the four mothers, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, we add the title Imenu, our mother. Today, by the way, marks the Yortzeit of our mother Rachel, who is known as Rachel Imenu in Hebrew, Rachel, our mother, or in Yiddish, Mame Rachel, our mother Rachel. By the way, in these United States, where our founding generation was heavily influenced by biblical history, by biblical stories and biblical language, the founding generation of our country, United States, is also founding fathers. Interesting to note. Anyway, the question is, how does this title fit for those who founded a new civilization, a new society, a new group of people? Generally, the word father implies a person who physically, biologically, creates a physical human being and brings them physically into the world, provides for them their DNA, and provides his energy and his strength so that they should have a good future. And what's a mother? The mother is the one who, this person was conceived in her womb and she carried him for 9 months, and then she sweated and worked hard so that he should be safe and happy. That's a mother. What does it mean when we're calling people of 4,000 years ago, who we and our parents never knew, and we're calling them our mothers and our fathers? What does that mean? What's the message? What's the implication? Not only that, there's another big question, particularly about Avraham Avinu. We know so much about him. What a guy. What a great achiever he was. Think about what he achieved. The revolutions he inspired. He was the first one to come up with, to break through the idolatry of the day and insist that the paganism is wrong and that there's a single God. Could have called him the revolutionary, Avraham the revolutionary. Or we could have called him the believer. He was the one who finally stood up for his faith. There were others who believed in God, but they never so publicly stood up for their faith, even willing to march personally, to throw himself into the fire of Nimrod, the king, to stand up for his faith. We could have called him Avram, the believer. He could have been Avram, the messenger, the one who delivers the word of Hashem to the whole world, to teach the world that there's a supreme being. And most of all, and most importantly, from all the stories we know about him that are written in the Torah, as opposed to other sources, he could have been called Avraham the kind, the man of kindness. That's really who he was. What a guy. Such an achiever. And all we have for him is we call him our father. There's a related question that's more textual that was asked by the Chaim of Volozhin in his commentary on the Mishnah tractate Avos called Ethics of Our Father. In the beginning of chapter 5, it says that there were 10 generations from Adam, the first man, Adam, till Noach, by the flood. There were 10 generations. And then the Mishnah says there were another 10 generations from Noach, by the flood, until Avram. No title. Then he says Avraham was tried with 10 tests. And in that context, the Mishnah refers to him as Avraham Avinu, Avraham our father. And the question is, what is it about the tests that turns Avraham into our father, where his own personal achievements didn't do it? There's an inspiring theme that appears quite often in Hasidic writings, and the Rebbe evoked this theme at a meeting of the supporters of the Lubavitcher Yeshiva. Avraham said, the Rebbe said about Avraham, he was not the first great man in history. There were great men in history, but they were a one-time phenomenon. There was nothing that followed them. They didn't leave over a legacy. Avraham was the first one to leave a legacy. He changed the role of greatness. He changed the meaning of greatness. Greatness used to be, what can I achieve? What can I be? And Avraham changed it. Not interested in what I can be. I want to know what's going to remain after I'm gone. The first man who was ever created was created by God's own hand, a precious human being. God himself collected the dust of the earth and formed the body, breathed life into that soul, breathed the soul of life into that body. The Talmud teaches that the heel of Adam's foot was more radiant than the sun, created by God's hand, it would be. And what does all this radiance leave? Who came after him? So Abel, Hevel, died in his youth. Cain, it's better we shouldn't talk about him. And there was a third son, Shais, that nothing impressive is written about him. So the greatness, the grandness, the brilliance, the holiness of Adam has no continuation. What about Noach, the next founder of the human race? Noach also, there's nothing really special written about his children. Certainly not in the text of the Torah. The only story we have is a vile story about his son, Ham. And that's it. Otherwise, we don't know anything about his children. So, Noach, who the Torah describes in grand and generous language, he was perfect. He was righteous in his generation and other generations. He walked with righteousness before God, and God appreciated him. What was left of it? There were other great men between Adam and Noach in those first 10 generations. There was a man called Methuselah. Methuselah lived the longest of any human being, and not by accident, on purpose. He was a pious man. He was a great man, a holy man, a good man. It says even that God told Noach, in another 7 days, the rain of the flood will begin to fall upon the earth. And the commentaries ask, why does God say in another 7 days? Why can't he say the rain is going to start falling? The answer is God was waiting not to spoil the days of Shiva for Misushelach. He had passed away, and the world, those who knew him, were grieving, and God was not going to spoil the days of grieving over Misushelach, because he was that good, he was that pious, he was that righteous. There was another man called Chanoch. Chanoch also was a pious man, a righteous man, a holy man, as indicated by the verse that it says, Chanoch walked with God, but then he was gone. He wasn't there. Why? It doesn't say he died. It says he wasn't there because God took him. This was such a pious person, a pure person, that God adopted him, hired him to work among the angels. He became the angel Matatrein, and he sits next to God, transcribing the memoirs. But what remains of these people? What remains of these great men? Adam and his holiness, Noach and his righteousness, Misushelach and his purity, Chanoch and his holiness. Gurnisht. There's nothing left. There was no continuation from them. And then comes Avraham. Avraham ushers in a new era in human life, not just philosophically and not just theologically. As a human being, he brought about a change to the perspective, to the outlook about what life is about. It's not about an individual. I don't live so that I can personally achieve something. Avraham says life is about a family, a group of people working together towards something great. All of a sudden, from Avraham, we learn it's not enough just to be great by yourself, to be an influential person by yourself, a successful person by yourself. Life is about educating other people about what you know is important. Life is about influencing the coming generation so that your values will carry on. Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they really believed powerfully in what they were doing, and they were convinced that they were going to change the world, and they fought with all their might to pass their values on to a new generation. And the fact is, there is no way to pass on your values to a new generation other than to have children and to educate them in accordance with your value system. We see from the record of the lives of the patriarchs in the Torah that their lives were consumed with their children. What are the stories we hear? From the time Isaac is born, Yitzchak, Avraham's life is consumed with his son. All we hear about him anymore is about his son. We hear a story about him burying his wife. Otherwise, it's all about his son. Yitzchak, what do we hear about Yitzchak? He's concerned about his older son, his younger son, the two of them. Who's going to marry who? What kind of women they're going to be involved with? The patriarchs they were truly all about their sons. Avraham himself even said, even after he had achieved greatness and influence and wealth, he had no children. He said, everything I have is worthless to me. He said to God, what can you give me? I am childless. Whatever you're going to give me is nothing. It's worthless to me. If I don't have a child, what's life worth? After the children were born, Avraham himself and Sarah herself, they're the ones educating the children. God commands Avraham to circumcise himself. It's not enough that he should be circumcised. Avraham circumcises his children. They're running an inn in the middle of the desert, in the wilderness, in the scorching heat. It's not enough that they should run the inn and they should host the guests and they should practice hospitality. They involve the children. The Torah says, when the angels, next week we'll read it in the parsha, when the angels come to visit Avraham and Sarah, guess what? Avraham is not happy just serving the guests himself. He gives the meat to his son Ishmael, that he should prepare the meat, that he should participate in the hospitality. They're training their children to live in their ways. That's what the whole life was about. Above all, Avraham and Sarah never stopped trying, never stopped making personal sacrifices to educate the children and to be a role model for them. And that's a tremendous key that the Rebbe is emphasizing. At that meeting with the supporters of the Lubavitcher Yeshiva, the Rebbe emphasized this point. He says the key to education is not to talk about education, but to put money towards education, to contribute to education from what is precious to you, so that your children can see what you really value, what your true priorities are. A parent has to demand from themselves twice as much as they expect from their children. Maybe this explains why in the Mishnah, when Avraham is just by himself, 10 generations from Adam until Noach, 10 generations from Noach till Avraham, Avraham is just Avraham. But when he's tried and tested and he sacrifices and he proves himself and he makes it clear what his priorities are, now he becomes Avinu. Now he becomes a father. Because he was a father, he knew he had to demand more of himself than he was demanding of his children, so that they could see and learn from him what the real priorities are. It's similar to a story we heard about Rabbi Adin Even Yisrael Steinsaltz. He passed away only a few months ago. A lot has been written already about his life, his amazing achievements. But in his last interview that he gave to the research students at Ben Gurion University, they asked him how would he like to be remembered? Adin Steinsaltz, how would you like to be remembered? And he said, the truth is, I really don't care how I'm remembered. I'm not really interested in what's going to be written on my tombstone. What I really want is to leave a tree that's going to continue growing even after I'm gone. And he said, in my garden, I planted 2 cypress trees. One, unfortunately, was stolen. The other one is not healthy. The top of the tree was actually chopped off. And Rabbi Steinsaltz says, I took pity on that tree, and I taped the top of the tree back on the part that fell off. I taped it back onto the living part of the tree. And you know what? The truth is that now it grew, and the split healed, came together, and now it's growing like a beautiful tree. And Rabbi Steinsaltz says, that's what I want. I want to take something, even a tiny truncated tree, and nurture it and plant it so that after I'm gone, it will grow and become a beautiful tree. It's not about me. It's not about what I am and what I'm not. The question is, what is going to remain when I'm gone? What's my legacy? There's a similar story also that happened in Europe several decades ago. That at that point, Europe was torn apart by war after war after war. And the Lithuanian government was always looking for money, and it was confiscating property from the rich and famous, until the people who yesterday were the engines of the economy, today they were destitute. So among those unfortunate people, there was one wealthy man who used to support all the Lithuanian yeshivas. He had the great mitzvah of supporting the yeshivas and the Torah students, and he lost everything. And he once said that he has 2 treasures that nobody can take away from him. His daughters married 2 brilliant Torah scholars, and that was his treasure. There was a rabbi, a famous, well-known rabbi, who knew this wealthy man pretty well, and he collected funds from him regularly. This was the famous Gaon, genius Torah scholar, Rabbi Elchanan Spector, that one of the heads of the Tel Yeshiva of Lithuania. And somebody once asked him, how did this merchant, this businessman, merit that his daughters, who grew up in a business world, should be interested in marrying Torah scholars, should have Torah as their lifestyle instead of business? And Rabbi Chanan told them, it's very clear to me. I used to collect money from this wealthy man to pay the salaries of the yeshiva each month. One time, the snow was piling up. It was the middle of the winter. There was a terrible blizzard, and the snow was piled 3 feet high, and the roads were muddy and messy and sloppy, and I didn't want to go. It was hard to go to collect this money from this wealthy man to pay the salaries, but responsible for the upkeep of the yeshiva and for the salaries of the people who work in the yeshiva, I had no choice. I had to go. As I'm approaching the house, says Rabbi Spector, he says, as I'm approaching the house, and I'm feeling terrible. I'm drenched. My boots are muddy. I'm going to walk into his house, his beautiful house with French carpets and fancy things. And I'm going to be dripping mud and water everywhere. I didn't want to. And so I arrived at his house, and I was going to knock on the front door. I couldn't. I went around to the servants' entrance by the kitchen. I knocked on the door of the kitchen, and his 5-6-year-old daughter answered the door. I see the rabbi is there. It was a great honor to see the rabbi. The kids were very excited because their father always greeted the rabbi with great respect, and so they appreciated that he was coming. And the daughter announces, "Father, the rabbi is waiting for you in the kitchen." The rabbi comes to the kitchen. He sees the rabbi standing in the kitchen, and his face turns white. He says, "Rabbi, what are you doing to the education of my daughters? You're ruining the education of my daughters." A whole month, I'm consumed with business. The only education they receive about the value of Torah is that they get to see me give you so generously and so happily. They get to see their father, the businessman, support Torah so generously and so happily. But now they're going to see the rabbi come in from the back door in the kitchen. I can't have this. Do me a favor, Rabbi. Go around to the front door, knock on the front door, and march your sopping, soggy self into the house and walk your muddy boots on the fancy carpet and sit your wet coat down on the couch so that my daughters will see what's really important to me. I have money. I have beautiful carpets. I have beautiful couches. But Torah is more important than all of it. Torah is more important than fancy things. Torah is more important than beautiful carpets. Torah is more important than fancy couches. And the rabbi did. And the rabbi tells the students who were asking, he says, now you see, so patently obvious why the children who grew up in this house appreciate the value of Torah. I heard something interesting from Rabbi Jacobson. It was after the passing of the previous Rebbe's mother, the 13th of Shvat. Rabbi Stern Sarah passed away, and the Rebbe was even without the passing of his mother, the Rebbe was already in very ill health from the terrible fight that he had put up against the Soviets, and he was in ill health from the terrible news that was coming to him from his community that was left in the Holocaust. And now his mother passed away, and he was an only child, so he was left alone in the world now. And a fellow rabbi came to console him, and he mentioned to him something from next week's parsha. He mentioned something to him from this week's parsha. He said, when Sarah passed away, next week's parsha, when Sarah passed away, it says that Avraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And it says, it's interesting, you'll notice in the Torah scroll, in the word to weep for her, one of the letters is written smaller than the others, to imply that Avraham's weeping was not out of control. He loved her very much. They were a team, but you don't see that he wept very, very much for her. It was pretty contained. And the commentaries say, why did he not weep terribly for his wife whom he loved so much? He says it's because she didn't leave the world without a legacy. She didn't leave the world as a barren woman. She had her son Yitzchak. And that mitigates the pain. That takes away some of the sadness of a person's passing when they leave a legacy that's really precious. Incidentally, remember the man was consoling the previous Rebbe whose name was Yitzchak. His second name was Yitzchak and his mother's second name was Sarah. So it was a double implication. Anyway, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is, and the Rebbe wrote it several times, that parents, knowing that generations naturally decline, parents have to take that into account when they're doing their Jewish education mathematics. And you have to figure out how much you have to do in order to be successful in raising good and pious children. You have to remember that children often say, oh, if I could be only half of what my parents were. And that's really the standard of children. I will be half of what my parents were. So if my father went to minyan 3 times a day, I'll go once a day. My father had a set time for studying Torah for 3 hours a day, 5 times a week. I'll have an hour a day, a couple times a week. We have to keep this in mind when we're making our calculations of what we have to do to educate our children and prepare the next generation to be good, strong Jews. We have to remember the key to leaving a legacy that's brilliant and beautiful is that we have to demand from ourselves twice as much than the minimum that we expect from our children. Shabbos.